talk, so I want to just get that
Oh, sure.
started.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to let people in as soon as this is turning on. Okay, I'm going to start the webinar.
I used to go to camp. The launch point was the Newton Marriott.
Oh, that is handy.
For camp in Maine, yeah. I know it well.
Yes, we used to go there for, speaking of grandmothers, for Mother's Day with my grandmother, the early bird special at that restaurant in the Newton Marriott.
That Newton Marriott is where I would cry and say goodbye to my mom every year. It's a beautiful place.
Exactly. Now we sometimes go kayaking from there.
So nice.
Welcome, everybody. As you come into the room, feel free to introduce yourselves in chat. We love to see who is in the room with us. We're going to get started in just a moment.
Wow, it's so great to see so many people joining. This is so exciting.
It's been really fun. And make sure, everybody, when you write in the chat, to send it to panelists and attendees so everybody else can see it too.
That's great. Oh my goodness, from far and wide.
People come from all over, which is fabulous. We really love it. We love it.
What time is it there?
I know, people are up in strange times.
Amazing.
Welcome.
Travel. Sorry.
Welcome, everybody, to the Quarantine Book Talks. I am Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive, and I'm really excited to be here with all of you again tonight and to be in conversation with our author, Bess Kalb, who I will introduce momentarily. I also want to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities for supporting our online programming, and to jewishLIVE for being a fabulous partner. For those of you who are new to JWA, we are a digital archive that helps expand the narrative of Jewish history by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We draw on the richness of our history for insight about the world today, and I invite you to check out jwa.org to discover the depth of our work. And in the spirit of our work, I want to acknowledge the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg this week, not just because it feels like a monumental historic event, but also because tonight we're going to be talking about a Jewish grandmother who was a strong and creative figure. And I keep thinking about how in All the Morning of RBG, as a public figure, I also want us to remember that she was a grandmother, she was a bubby, and it feels fitting to invoke her presence tonight as we begin. A moment of logistics. Introduce yourself in the chat box. Please ask questions in the chat box. I will be sure to bring them into our conversation. And again, make sure to chat to panelists and attendees. And on to our program for tonight. I'm so excited to be here with Bess Kalb, who's an Emmy-nominated comedy writer and the author of the bestseller, Nobody Would Tell You This But Me, which is a fabulous book. If you don't have it yet, you should definitely buy it. A New York Times Editor's Choice. She wrote for 8 years on Jimmy Kimmel Live and also writes for the New Yorker's Daily Shouts. She's received many different awards and has written for many award shows, including the Emmy Awards, the Academy Awards, and this isn't an award show, but the 2020 DNC. Welcome, Bess. So glad to have you here with us tonight.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you to the JWA. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in and being here with us. It's thrilling to see people from so many places saying hello. Shana Tova to everybody.
Yes, it's really fun to see people gathering from all over the world and creating this community around books and Jewish women's stories. So we're so glad that you could be part of this. And we hope that you are safe in LA. We know this is a time when California is going through a really rough time. So
yes, it's harrowing on the news. We look outside and, it's a hazy sky, but we're safe. The fires are nowhere near us. And my 13-month-old is just thrilled to have me and my husband in the house all day, not going outside, paying lots of attention to him. So
yes, it's the babies and the puppies that are really, really happy these days. And everyone else,
the best thing that could have happened to us.
Everyone else is losing their mind.
That's right.
So to start talking about your book, which is such a beautiful and creative thing, and particularly the format of the book is really unusual in that it is a memoir of your grandmother written in her voice by you. So sort of memoir, sort of oral history. It's this intergenerational matrilineal love story. What prompted you to write your grandmother's story and to write it in this kind of unusual format?
What prompted it is grief. I started writing this book unintentionally right after my grandmother died. Within 48 hours of her death, I was already, writing what ended up being a voicemail in the book, because it was my job to give the eulogy at her funeral. And when I was tasked with that impossible writing assignment, my grandmother was one of the great loves of my life. She was my best friend in that I spoke to her every day. She was the person, we knew each other's business. You know, she knew what was happening in my life. I knew what was happening in hers. We really did speak every day on the way home from work. And if one of us didn't hear from the other person, we'd think there was an emergency, and my mom would never hear the end of it. But so I had to deliver the eulogy for this woman, which was daunting and impossible. And through my grief and writer's block, I turned to my husband at 2 a.m. in the hotel the morning of her funeral, and I said, would it be in poor taste to just do it in her voice, to just do the eulogy as her? And he said, potentially. And I said, trust me, she knows, I know, I'm doing this. And I got up there and I read the transcript, a sort of creative take on the transcript of one of the voicemails that she left me. And in doing that and standing in front of the people who loved my grandma Bobby and knew her most, her family, they were laughing, and a few people were crying at the same parts that I was crying reading. And I realized, you know, this wasn't a literal transcript of a voicemail. This was me sort of doing her voice, combining a few ideas that she would get through in voicemails: the guilt, the love, the stories that were really about something else. And I realized, okay, I can channel her. Yeah.
And what was it like to do that, to sort of be a ventriloquist for your grandmother?
I mean, you're not the first person. The first person who said that word to me about this book was my editor, the great Robin Desser at Knopf, who is brilliant, and working with such an incredible woman on this was a gratifying experience in and of itself. But she called it literary ventriloquism because it's not quite a memoir, and it's certainly not fiction. This is the real story of a real woman's life, but it's in her voice from beyond the grave. And in some ways that word I recoil at a little bit, because I'm like, oh, it sounds like a trick, or something that's like a spectacle, but it really is, I think, just like a less spooky way of saying a channeling. And so it really, I think it's an accurate way to describe it. And you know, I think when you know somebody really well, you can kind of conjure them. You know what they would say in a certain situation, especially a family member, someone who you love and know. You have them in your head anyway. And so this was a matter of having her in the head and then being able to get her onto the page. And that's what that was.
Well, she comes through so clearly, and you really get a sense of her voice. So it's amazing.
Oh, thank you. I mean, it's great because, you know, the truth is, and I didn't know, especially because this was such a personal exercise. This was something that initially was just shared with friends and family, with her loved ones. I didn't know if her voice would translate. I didn't know if anyone would care. I mean, I sent this to my literary agent, what ended up being the first 50 pages of the book. And I said, this is a grief exercise. This is nothing. This is about my grandma. Nobody will get this. Apologies, ignore. I'll send you a real book proposal later. And my literary agent, who is not Jewish, and from Ohio, didn't grow up around many Jews, has like a large family, didn't know her grandparents. She was like, oh, if I get this and I am falling in love with this opinionated Jewish woman, maybe there's something here.
Right. One of the things we talk about often at JWA is, you know, the importance of the sort of everyday stories of women's lives and everybody's lives, but we focus on women's lives, obviously. And, you know, we often talk about how everybody has a story and every story matters. And, you know, the flip side of that, which we, you know, don't kind of include in the headline of that, is every story matters, but not every story matters to everyone, right? Like, we care most about the stories that have to do with our own lives or our own experiences or speak to us in some way. But I think that there is a way that your book shows why sometimes everybody's story matters, even to the people that it might not matter to, because in the specificity of your grandmother's character, which comes live on the page, there is so much to relate to, whether your grandmother was like her or not. Just that kind of like love, you know, the depth of connection that allows for both criticism and love and humor, and just knowing someone so well that you can, you know, finish each other's sentences or anticipate what the rhythm is going to be.
Totally. I mean, that's it's incredibly flattering to you say that, but it also that was such a conscious choice to tell the story of someone who was an everyday person. My grandmother was not, a captain titan of industry. She didn't discover anything. This isn't a book about a celebrity or even a historical figure. My grandmother was an ordinary woman in every sense, and she was the most extraordinary woman I have ever known. And I think the two can coexist, because just the mere fact of her love and her being this opinionated force in my life made her superhuman to me. And that really was almost a gap in the literature. I grew up reading books by Jewish men, and you have your Philip Roths, your Saul Bellows, the sort of this canon of like, well, the Jewish male experience is this great literary adventure, and then the woman is in the kitchen, or the woman is the love interest, and this is to say, no, this is a matrilineal. This is a book that is really just about a great grandmother, mother, and daughter. And the men are really ancillary characters, and it's cool to see that has an audience, and that has and that I'm seen as somebody who's the chronicler of the Jewish women in my family. It gives these women the audience they always deserved.
And so often it's the women who are the storytellers and are the kind of history holders.
Yes.
But I think also when we do see the Jewish women figures in literature, they're often painted in a really negative light, right? Like Mrs. Portnoy or something like that. And so,
Oh.
How did you think about that? Sort of, how do you, especially in some of the, kind of funnier parts of the book where you're calling on certain kinds of tropes of Jewish humor in some ways,
Yes.
How do you not fall into stereotype, which I think could have easily happened and didn't feel to me like you did?
Totally. I mean, that was the biggest challenge. It was, how do you not do shtick? I'm already doing a voice. I'm doing a character. I'm my grandmother, and in this book. And I think with every sentence, with every word, I was constantly aware of this sort of fine line between truth and caricature, between character and caricature, really. But the heart of it was just keeping it honest and keeping it true to her voice. And I knew that if I was just true to her voice and speaking as she spoke and saying what she would say, then if it's caricature, then there's fine, then maybe people are being anti-Semitic. But in reality, I think there are certainly Jewish mother characters out there that are played for laughs and played to sort of be a broad example of a certain stereotype. There are aspects of my grandmother, the guilt tripping, the comments about my body. There are aspects that fall into that, but she was a complicated person and so much more than that. And I think in showing the many facets of her, even if there are parts that were like, yes, that's a classic Jewish grandma moment, they're just tiny parts of a whole. And so focusing on the whole was my way around that.
I want to touch on something that you said, which is you mentioned, the issue of truth, and the subtitle of the book is A True as Told to Me Story. So how did you think about truth in writing this?
So you said something earlier, which is something that I've thought about a lot, which is that the women are the ones who tell the stories. In that sense, it's sort of her word against the readers. It's the idea of what a true story is. The idea of what a memoir is super subjective and impossible to prove and impossible to pin down. There is always fiction in our stories, especially the women in my family. You could hear the same story told by three people and not even know that they were about the same characters. And I think the true as told to me story is the accurate way to describe this game of intergenerational telephone that this book is. These are stories in this book. The book tells the life story of my grandmother. It also tells the story of our relationship. It tells the story of her contentious, very difficult relationship with her only daughter, my mom. And it tells the story about the shtetl, none of which I was present for, and some of which she wasn't present for. And so it's really drawing upon that female storytelling tradition of like things become legends, things become myths, but ultimately there's heart and truth and a lesson in everything. And so even though this is not a journalistic account of her life, it is the impression she left on me. And I think that really is the truth. You are what you leave behind.
Right. I had a funny conversation once with a lawyer who's involved with JWA when we were doing an oral history project, and she was like, "How do you, fact check it?" And I was like, so she was saying, asking me as a historian, like, how do historians fact check it? And I was like, we don't fact check oral history exactly. You just take it as something that is not totally reliable, because memory isn't reliable, and you'd actually take any source as something that is not totally reliable because it comes out of a context, it's written by a certain person, so you have to bring a critical analysis to it. But nothing is, if it's gone through a human framework, is going to be perfect. There are going to be a lot of different versions of the same thing.
Totally. This book would be very different if my mother wrote it about the same characters, very different if my grandmother wrote it, frankly. This is just this is sort of the filter, the framework that I have about all of it. And, it is my way of giving her the last word in that way, but it's still my telling of it.
Right.
So take it with a grain of salt.
And did you have to do research? I mean, you go into a lot of detail about like your great grandmother. Yeah. So did you have to do research to fill in the stories, or had she really told you so much of that history?
So this is one of the exciting things about doing a Zoom event as opposed to if this were in person, where we're in my office, where I wrote the book. I can show you the college course of books that I read about the pogrom and the shtetl. And there's my air purifier because of my allergies, but I'll bring over to you guys. I mean, this is a little, I'll show you.
Yeah, we get to see the inside glimpse.
We do. This is a small amount of the books that were read to figure out what life would have been like for a 12-year-old girl under the Pale of Settlement in Tsar Alexander's Belarus, specifically in a shtetl right outside of Pinsk. And so to get to that sort of micro idea, I read this great book, and very depressing book, if you want to feel grateful about your Postmates being a little bit late, Pogrom, I recommend. The Atlas of Jewish History, which is amazing. I mean, you basically see where our ancestors came from, and I think in seeing it on a map, that was something that gave me a daunted, sort of awestruck view of the sheer distance that people who made that great migration made. The Jews of Eastern Europe, very dry, and by far the most important book that I read in terms of like getting all of the facts right. And just for some color, the golden age of shtetl, to understand like, okay, well, where did they get the meat? Where do you go to school? What is that like? And then Becoming Soviet Jews, which my husband, who is not Jewish, if you've read the book, you know that, has heard me talk about to no end. I would be like, they couldn't buy kosher food because the prices were, and he was like, we are in Los Angeles, and at that point, 2017, and I'm trying to get through dinner. But this is all to say, research is how I did that. And it was research in I didn't know I was pregnant at the time. I was newly pregnant on our winter hiatus from Kimmel. And I sat here with this stack at my desk and just sort of crash coursed myself in what it might have been like for someone else. And then once I had that sort of historical foundation for what life was like and what was happening, that's when I called my grandpa and said, okay, tell me anything you remember about Sam and Rose and what their life was like in Russia. And that's when he sent me pictures. And I have these photographs, which are impossible. Some of them are in the book. Some of them were too precious to share that way, but they look like, almost, talk about caricature. It's like the beard, the rags, the schmata, the whole thing. And I saw my people. I saw where I came from. And so with that sort of emotional connection and the sort of academic connection to it, I was able to piece together from the scant line that I knew about Rose. I knew one sentence about her, and it was in my grandmother's obituary, the paid family obituary in the Palm Beach Post. It was, Bobby Bell was the daughter of Rose Otis, who fled from Russia alone at age 13 and came to America. That sentence is talk about a short story.
Yeah.
So I had given myself a sort of understanding of what our ancestors, if you're an Ashkenazi Jew from, Eastern Europe like me, where they came from. And then from that, I was able to extrapolate this entire passage. And the passage in the book is really short. It was a lot of work for essentially one chapter, but it was the most important chapter in the book, because it explains everything about my grandmother and it explains everything about me. And I think when you're writing about women who are living a comfortable enough life and they have chips on their shoulders and they're ferociously protective of their young and they're always buying things on sale. There's this sense of scarcity no matter what. That's the pogrom. That's the shtetl. That's that sort of the fear that happened within the century of their lifetimes. And so I think having there's also something that is not Jewish that I turn to for this book, which I recommend if you find, look, we all have a lot of time on our hands. We're quarantined. Here's something that I did. I read congressional testimony of Italian immigrants in the 1890s, right around the assassination of the Tsar during that Great Migration. Italian immigrants who came over on steamships from Hamburg, that similar journey across the Atlantic, testified in front of Congress to fight for safety regulations and rights for immigrants who came over to Ellis Island. And that's how I figured out, oh my God, they would sleep this many people to a birth. They were selling fake tickets. They were selling fake upgrades. They would eat slop from a pile. And that was a non-oral history. That objective congressional testimony is as close as you can get to the truth. And so this chapter and this story was written quite literally like on the shoulders of the immigrants and Jewish people who came before me and came before Rose and with Rose. And it aims to not just tell my family's story, but to tell all of their stories, that extraordinary migration story.
Yeah, you did it. I would never have guessed that you were going on so little of the original story. And you did an amazing job of kind of fleshing it out. And I think it does provide a really important context for kind of understanding the arc of the story, which, in some ways is like the trajectory of the kind of American dream in some ways, right? It's like, you arrive with nothing, you work really hard, you have a lot of creativity and boldness, and you become successful. And in one generation or a couple generations go so far that you can't even really imagine what the past is.
Yeah, it's astronomical. In moments where, and lately, especially in quarantine, there are moments where it's hard to find gratitude and to we're in the same four walls all the time. Many of us who are still in places where the pandemic is pretty serious. It's hard to, and separated from our families, especially families that are a plane flight away. And knowing that we have survived so much and so much worse is that strength for me, certainly. And I know it was for my grandma.
Right. And I was thinking a lot about that family separation of knowing, like, my kids I have twins who are almost 14, and thinking like, what would it have been like to send your kid away knowing you would never see them again? And then you were doing it for them. But to just, I just can't even imagine that.
I wasn't allowed to take the subway when I was 13. This is totally, and by the way, I shouldn't have been allowed to take the subway when I was 13. I would still be wandering around Coney Island. Like I don't know how she did it. It's a miracle that anyone survived the journey.
Yeah. But it's also an interesting thing of thinking about, like, thinking about that particular immigrant arc, and then thinking about where does that story differ from other immigrant stories? How does it relate to immigrant journeys today? We live in a time when there are still, some of these stories really would resonate with people's experiences today as well.
Yes, that struggle has certainly not ended. We are living in a time where there are people who are enduring the same kind of, horrifying choice and impossible odds. And it gave me a lot of empathy in seeing my own history in absolutely seeing how many people are struggling with similar journeys today.
Yeah. We have a couple questions about how your mom reacted to the book. You know, you talk, obviously you and your grandmother had a very close relationship. As you mentioned, it sort of skipped your mom in a certain way. They had a more difficult relationship. So I'll ask that question of how your mom reacted, and also sort of how did you think about writing through that? Because that could be a very tricky thing to write about.
Yes. If anybody wants to save hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on therapy, I recommend writing a book about your mother when she was a child. It's an amazing I don't know why they don't teach this at like Harvard Medical School for psychiatry residents. It's a great trick and it worked. My mom and I were always very close. That was never really an issue. I mean, you know, when I was 12, I was a nightmare, but we got over it. But I relied on my mom to write this book. My mom was the primary source. I certainly called on my grandpa. You know, it was much more painful for him. I talked to, if you've read the book, you know the characters of David and Leo and Georgie, the brothers, one of David's surviving relatives, and Georgie's daughter, who actually passed away recently, my cousin Jeannie, who's an amazing woman. So I did reach out to many relatives, but my mom was the middle of the night call. And it ended up, and again, to my face, she liked the book. Who knows what she's telling her friends and therapists. Right. But it ended up being certainly a healing process for the two of us. And she later told me, and I'll tell 250 of my closest friends, that it was healing for her to talk about her mom. And I won't speak to her experience, but I can say, as a grateful daughter, I was really proud of my mom for being able to relive so many hard stories. Specifically, if you've read the book, then you know the chapter Pink Milk. That was something that my mom it would be a great scene in a movie. She just kind of walked into my office with a cup of tea in her hand and just kind of told the story and then walked out. So I was sitting there and I was like, okay, I have to remember almost all of that. Because she knew I was writing, and she, you know, and she was, and she, by the way, she knew it was a mic drop moment. She walked in and told this amazing chapter and then left. But she, you know, she was not somebody who was unloved. You know, this isn't the story of somebody who had a mother who was purposefully cruel or neglectful. She just had a mom who was from a different generation. This was not a generation, certainly like I am obsessing over my son's little like Montessori perfect toys and like making sure he feels seen and like don't hug him without, you know, I'm like the nightmare LA mom. Her mom was a very different, was from this immigrant survivor and of pogrom and journey and you know, harrowing journey. And then she herself internalized that kind of coldness. And when she had my mom, her only daughter in the middle of the century, and found herself this young housewife who didn't have many career options and didn't have examples of sort of women doing anything else other than being a mother, there was some resent there. And there was a sense of being trapped. And that is where that came from. It was not from being a bad mom or unloving person. She certainly made up for that with me. But it was just a different kind of motherhood idea. And, you know, she is, if this book says nothing else, then she is overabundantly forgiven for that by all of the women who came after her.
Well, and I think also you put it into some context. Like, I mean, first of all, you showed the connection and love that was there. Like that story about how she somehow knew that your mom was sick in Paris. And you get the sense that there was a deep connection, even if there was a lot of fighting.
Yes.
But also like that sense of, and again, like I suspect she was able to say some of this to you, or you were able to articulate it in some way for her, and she didn't say it to your mom. But though that sort of like, you know, mid-century feminine mystique narrative, like it's very much part of women's story of certain kinds of women in that period of just feeling like they have all this potential, they have all this energy, and they I mean, I actually wrote down one of the lines from this. You say that she said, I was mourning the loss of a life I never had a chance to live. So seeing that resentment, that sense of like not understanding where your fulfillment exactly is supposed to come from, that it's very hard not to be sympathetic to that in some way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that paragraph was something that was exactly me trying to sort of absolve that. And I think that Paris example is really great. Also, her being the one who drove my mom to colleges when my mom sort of defiantly announced at 16 that she had to get out of the house and go to college. My grandma was the one behind the steering wheel with the suits in the back, helping her along. And when my mom said that, she wanted to be a doctor, my grandma was the one who said, okay, then you're going to be a doctor, and then put everything in motion to make that happen. And so she was in my mom's corner. It just wasn't, it just was a little bit more complicated than a cheerleader. It was somebody who was dealing with her own struggles and resent.
And I thought it was also interesting because it's not like your grandmother, comes across as sort of like a traditional feminist, but you get this real feminist sense from, or like that there were a lot of feminist lessons that you learned from her, whether or not she knew she was transmitting them.
Yes, totally. This is not, my grandmother was not a bra burner, but at the same time, she marched on Washington, and she, when I went to the Women's March after the election, my grandmother asked me to call her from the crowd. And
Mm.
I thought that she was, and this is partially true, that this is also the case. I thought she was calling because she was afraid that I was, and that is definitely partially why, but she also wanted just to hear it.
She wanted
And
to be
that was,
there in some way.
yeah. And that was really cool to me. It was like, and she was, and then her birthday happens to be on International Women's Day.
Hmm.
And right after she died, this is not in the book, but um, right after she died, I went to the plaza. I had tea with her picture, and that was on her birthday. And outside the plaza, marching on Trump Tower, right in that area, was this women's march-ish thing, this like International Women's Day march. And so I took the picture from tea at the plaza down the street. It was a very surreal but fitting time. She was someone who both had her tea and her like righteousness too.
Yeah, I love that juxtaposition.
Yeah.
um, let's maybe hear a little bit of her voice. There have been some requests to hear your grandmother's voice and your voice.
Sure. Well, if you turn to page 77 in your Haggadah, I'm so glad I could make that joke because I've made it to my husband at this, but now I have an audience where like, I know we all get it. So
Exactly. We can all appreciate it.
thank you for indulging it. Sorry. I apologize. Once a comedy writer. Okay. But on page 77, if you're following along, this is to set it up a little bit. And it dovetails nicely. The phone calls when she thinks I'm in immediate peril is a big theme in our relationship and also in this book. And so this is a phone call that happened right before my then boyfriend, now husband, I won. It worked out. When we were going away on a trip together, a trip that she did not approve of, and you will find out why. Phone call December 2011. Bessie, Grandma? Bess, thank God in heaven I got you. You haven't left for Yosemite Park? No, we're packing. We're about to get in the car. What's up? You're going to be freezing. It's freezing there. I know, I've packed a lot of warm layers and I'll be inside. No, you won't. You'll be outside. Your mother says you're cross-country skiing. Yes, Charlie's family really likes to cross-country ski. I don't understand it. It's a ridiculous thing to do. It's not skiing, it's shuffling. It's fun. It's being outdoors, and it's actually not that hard. We practiced in Maine on a golf course. But you're not going to be on a golf course. One fall and you snap your leg and you're lying there in the middle of the wilderness and you can't get up. Surrounded by Charlie's family. And how's that going to look? They take you outside for 1 second and you're belly up in a ditch. Charlie led outdoor wilderness trips for kids at a camp for 5 summers. I couldn't be with anyone more prepared for disaster. Well, you are not some 10-year-old boy he can throw in a backpack at a moment's notice. You're not exactly small. Charlie, will you tell my grandma I'm not going to die in Yosemite? And this is my husband's only line in the book. I'm not getting involved in this. Charlie says everything's going to be fine and he's very prepared. I thought you were worried about me being cold. Can't I be worried about more than one thing? Why don't they take you someplace normal, even normal skiing? Somewhere with a hotel you can sit in. They like roughing it, being in nature, because they didn't come from suffering. They never chased mice around the attic with a broomstick and survived on $40 a week. I thought it was $45 a week. It was just enough to starve. Please, Grandma, just, you know what's roughing it? Lying on a straw bed with meningitis. And the only medication we can afford is cod liver oil from the Italian neighbor whose son got his hand caught in a meat grinder. Grandma, it's going to be fine. Does your jacket have a lining? My jacket has a lining. Bring a hat.
Oh, great. I think basically what I can't worry about more than one thing should be like probably tattooed on my forehead.
Mine too. Now that I have a son, I'm like, yes, does your jacket have a lining? Like, by the way, I relate far more to her than I do to myself now that I'm a mother.
It's so great. I think one of the things that I think was also really interesting about the book, I mean, you've talked about some of the history, which is obviously a very specific Jewish history, although not only, as you said, reading the testimonies of Italian immigrants too, it's not only Jewish stories, but it's a very Jewish story. I mean, even sort of the cadence, right? And the Jewishness is a very kind of specific Jewish femaleness that I think many of us can recognize. But it's also not like explicitly about Jewishness. So I'm wondering how you sort of related to the Jewishness of the story. Like, what feels Jewish about this to you? If it feels Jewish to you, how did you think about that piece of it?
So I didn't realize how explicitly Jewish it was, and I am, until I wrote this book. We belong to a synagogue. We go to high holy days, and we, like for Rosh Hashanah, we had our round challah, we lit the candles, fine. But I'm not somebody for whom the Jewish religion is part of my everyday life. Until I wrote this book, when I realized it's part of my everyday breaths. It's part of my every molecule. It's part of the molecules around me. It's so part of me. And I realize that is because of this matrilineal. It's because, and it's fitting that in the Jewish religion, you're Jewish if your mother is Jewish in every way. And as a mother of a son whose father is not Jewish, my husband is a WASP from Maine, as now you know. My son is absolutely Jewish. And I think in seeing that, in becoming a mother, it was sort of renewed in me. And in writing this book about my grandmother, it was renewed in me. And I think the parts of this book that are so Jewish are the parts about, oddly, are the parts about my relationship when I brought this non-Jew into the family, the first non-Jew really to marry into our tree from however many centuries it's gone, before being stamped out every once a century. But truly, this is, I am here because of strong Jewish women, and the Jewish faith is a big part of that, is a big part of why those Jewish women were so strong. The opening of this book is a chapter called The Fruit of the Vine. The opening after the funeral, the opening section of the opening part, called My Mother, is called The Fruit of the Vine, and it begins on a Shabbat service, and it begins with a prayer and with a tradition of my great grandmother, this woman, this imposing woman who had my grandma at 40, who was this little girl who escaped the shtetl and turned into this tough as nails Brooklyn woman, still impoverished, but very proud. And it begins with her putting a napkin over her head and covering her eyes and lighting the candles and reciting the prayers, this incantation. And in writing that and realizing how anchoring that was for her, and realizing that the reason that she fled was her Judaism, it's not just the promise of America, it's what she was running from certain death. It made me realize how we are all here. All of the women in my family, all of the people in my family, and now my son are here because of this woman's escape from Jewish persecution, and how she held on to her Judaism and didn't assimilate, and was proud to stand there in America where she was safe, still being Jewish, was really profound to me.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it comes through in some, in I was thinking about this as you were talking about the kind of history and the pogrom piece, and knowing that that not only informs us in ways that are conscious, but also in ways that are unconscious. I mean, we know now that it, like you said, it's part of every molecule, and we know now, like, actually, as we know from epigenetics, like it actually shapes our very, you know, cells and how we respond to things in ways that we have no control over.
Yes.
Um, and
I'll
not
tell you
only in
this.
negative ways. I mean, I think the epigenetics piece is often like seen as a negative thing, but it's also like the resilience, the, survival instincts, the creativity, the like forcefulness, some of the things that sometimes I think around Jewish women can be coded negative, but I think are also often like real sources of strength and resource and survival.
Yeah, it's why our tribe has endured for so many centuries, is exactly those survival instincts, including humor. Um, yeah. So, the necessary deflections when you're somebody who's like running with unleavened bread on your back, like you're going to need to crack some jokes to get
Right,
through.
exactly. Um, so you are, as I think we said at the beginning, a comedy writer, and you've written for Jimmy Kimmel Live, among other shows. So how did you think of this writing in relationship to your comedy writing?
Yeah, the book, if you've read it, goes sad. It's a sad book. And I think the anchor for the book, or the buoys along the way, and what makes it feel whole and real to me is the comedy. So the passage that I read definitely is one of the more comedic passages, but it's not a sort of like, oh shucks, like look at what my grandma said, like isn't this funny? It's a book about a real person. And so it was a challenge to go beyond the jokes for me. In my job, I'm able to write a joke and let it be a setup punchline, a pithy thing about the news, and move on. But this, you do that, and then you say, okay, well, what's really underneath the joke? What's the suffering that made that sense of humor happen? What's the paranoia that made that sense of humor happen? And so this is sort of like the joke is the tip of the iceberg, and then the life is everything else. And so it was like a comedy assignment, but also the assignment was to really, really figure out what was underneath it all.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Do you feel like your grandmother's voice comes into your comedy in other ways?
Yes, my grandmother was the funniest person in any room, both intentionally and unintentionally. I mean, she is somebody who didn't suffer fools, and also like had a way with words. She could as you saw with it, like she could land a line. She could level a room with, in another lifetime, she could have been a Joan Rivers style like road comic and just do a sort of crowd work about everybody. Like, oh, you think that's a hat? That's a dead animal. Like her,
Right.
she could have a career. And talking with her, I was definitely the straight man. Like as I am in this book, it's sort of she gets the laugh lines, and I'm just sort of like, okay, um, like pump the brakes. And so yeah, she inspired me in that I was constantly laughing when I was around her. Um, and she also just had great taste in comedy too. Like she would walk out of a movie if it wasn't funny, or if it was like vulgar and not for good reason. And like and she loved shows that were funny, and loved comedians that are really funny. And um I was very lucky to have grown up laughing because of her, and that made me want to keep other people laughing.
Who were some of your other comedy influences?
I mean, I was a real comedy kid when I was little, but secretly. I was like a very
Hmm.
studious person. I was not a class clown at all. I was like the idea of like making a joke and like other people laughing is still, I'm not a performer, I'm a comedy writer, but to do anything that would remotely upset a teacher was like was like to this day I have actual nightmares about that. So I was a secret comedy nerd. And I would watch old episodes of SNL on VHS. I would watch Monty Python's Holy Grail, Life of Brian. I would watch Kids in the Hall. I would watch just like things for kids that were funny. All that was a big deal when I was growing up. Just I was constantly consuming funny things and comedy. And I got really, really into it as a teenager when I figured out there was this person called Sarah Silverman, and everything she said made my jaw drop. And I wanted to know what wizardry, what power she had. And then I basically like memorized her sets. And, I ended up becoming really, really obsessed with comedy and comedy podcasts. And Mark Maron's podcast is one. And when I was still living my sort of studious life as a political science undergraduate and then journalist, I started tweeting. I went on Twitter and started writing jokes, just observational comedy jokes on the side, just for my friends. And then eventually SNL people and Letterman people found my jokes and started retweeting them. And I was part of a secret comedy club online. But I was a fact checker at Wired magazine. And my job was to be like, hello, sir. Like, unfortunately, according to the abstract of this paper, it's inaccurate to say, like, right. So it was it was like a secret life. But it gave me this rush, that rush of like, oh, this is the thing I'm meant to be doing, but there's no job in it. So, yeah, this is a very long-winded answer. But
well, I love the scene in the book where your grandmother pushes you to like reach out to a friend about a comedy job. And you're like, no, I can't do that. And she's like, what would a man do? And you're like, he would call a friend and say, I'm interested in the job.
That, and honestly, that is the feminism piece of this, which is that it wasn't my grandma saying, separate from men and live in a commune. It was her saying like, take a page from them. They say what they mean. They don't worry about how it'll be received, how they'll be thought of. They say what they mean. When they believe in what they're saying, and they also aren't afraid in arenas because they're allowed to be there. So you should just, what would a man do? And to this day, I'm working on a show right now that I sold, and I'm the head writer of it. And 12 times a day, I'm just sort of like, as I have to send another email, I'm just like, what would a man do? And I'm like, I'm sorry, it would be great. And then I'm like, delete sorry. And it's just, it would be great if that could be here by Wednesday. And it's revolutionary to me. Jewish Women's Archive, if there's nothing else I take from my grandma Bobby, what would a man do? Such a good trick, but not always, because honestly, the more powerful trick is what would a woman do? And that's the you have to know when to apply it.
Exactly. I was about to say, it's like, it's all in the knowing when to draw on the power that men have and when to draw on the power that women have.
Yes. I think the real puzzle is don't just be careful about doing what we are socially conditioned as women to think we have to do. And I think that's a much less pithy way of saying what would a man do, but it really was don't necessarily apologize when you don't mean sorry, and believe in yourself a little bit, even if the world doesn't.
And it takes an enormous amount of practice. I mean, it's like, it's a practice, like in the meaning of the term practice, something you have to do over and over and over again. I'm in my mid 40s and I still have to be like, okay, I'm going to do, delete the apology, or I'm not going to, end by saying, is that okay? Or,
I still do. Even right now, I'm like, is it okay that I just said, what would a man do? But yeah, totally practice makes, practice makes people thinking that you have some understanding of what you're doing.
Right. Well, it's very exciting to hear that you have a new show. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
It's about to be announced. It's not announced yet, so I have to be a little bit vague about it. But it is women-centered and women-focused. All of the writers are women, which is awesome. Great. I hired an all-female writers' room. All the performers are women, and it's comedy. So
that sounds great. Well, we can't wait to hear more about it and to get to have you back to talk about it on our podcast or wherever.
I would love it.
What is writing like for you now in the pandemic? Has your work changed? Sort of tell us a little bit about the writer's life in quarantine.
So there's this TV project that I'm working on. And then there is the movie adaptation of the book. And that's the big project that I'm working on. I was very fortunate to be able to sell the rights to the book to a small production company that would let me write the screenplay and have a female director. And those were the two really important things, which is I didn't want to hand over my grandma's voice to someone else. This is still her story, and it's my job to do that. She's not a character; she's my grandma. Even when and so, I feel like I still have control of it, and the story, and her words, and preventing it from going into shtick, all of that. And the director is this amazing woman, Elizabeth Chomko, who directed a movie about an older woman. And that was something that was really important, that to have a movie about a woman in her 80s, or, middle age through her 80s. That's also not something that's a very Hollywood thing. And it can be handled in a way that I don't find sensitive or accurate. And I know that it's in the hands of somebody who can do that. She wrote a movie with Blythe Danner and Michael Shannon called What They Had, and it was really beautiful. But the production company that is making it made this movie Bad Education, starring Hugh Jackman and Allison Janney, about the Long Island school fiasco. And it's so good. And I know that it's in good hands. And so with all of that said, my job is to make a movie out of this. Mm-hmm. And even though there's a great team around it, and I love their way of telling true stories and telling stories about real flawed people and about women, I have to do this difficult job of knowing what doesn't need to be in the movie. And so my job as a writer is it feels like I'm still in this project. It's a flashback. I'm back in the stories of Georgie and Leo. I'm back in the stories of Paris and hospitals and Florida and lunch, and I'm back in it. And so now my job is to see scenes from the book. And I've always been a solitary writer. I always have just been in front of this computer that is now my friend, just writing. And I feel like the career that is least affected by the pandemic, or the people who are least affected, are writers, because we're like, yes, the world is, well, I'll just assume there's no social life happening in the world. I'll just write.
Right. Except that now you're not alone. Everyone descends on you. So it's probably harder to get a little quiet space.
Yeah, having an infant. I mean, what you're not seeing is the floor of my office, which is sort of like various toys with buttons that if you press will play a satanic song at the top of the song.
Right. Well, that is very exciting to hear. I can imagine it would be hard to, once you've crafted a book, to figure out then how do you take pieces of it out? How do you, and especially when it's someone you love and you don't want to erase her at all.
Yes. I think one thing, as a TV writer who wrote a book, I wrote in scenes. I wrote the scene that I just read was quite literally dialogue, but I also wrote visually. And so and also hearing from readers about scenes from the book that resonated with them and felt sort of indelible to them and really visual to them has been really helpful. I'm basically like, I don't know, do you guys want to write with you? Yeah, but.
Well, Deborah is asking whether you recorded your grandmother, and I think you saved all her voicemails, right?
Yes, this is another thing that Zoom will allow, because we couldn't do this if we were in a big auditorium. I can actually show you the voicemails, which are still right here on my, let's see, is this in focus? Yeah, oop. Oh, don't delete. Yeah, it's just Grandma
Scarsdale, Grandma Palm Beach.
Yeah, it's all there.
Wow.
Yeah. That's
pretty amazing. And do you still listen to them? Like, do they provide you with regular comfort, or it's good to just know they're there when you need them?
Yeah, they're just there. She's just in my pocket, or my handbag, or on my desk. They're private for, I'll tell you the story. We have a little bit of time. I didn't listen to them for a really long time. I didn't even listen to them when I was writing the book about the voicemails. Those were just from memory. And then I recorded an audiobook of Nobody Will Tell You This With Me. It was so fun to do. It was just that reading, but in audiobook form. I've heard from people they like the audiobook better. But for the audiobook, Penguin Random House said, well, we've got to have the voicemails in it. And I said, you're right. That's exactly where they should be. That's makes sense. That's great. Bonus material. People will have known her. Now they can hear her. Great. And we were all saying, great. And this is great. And they said, so send them. And I said, yes, definitely. And they were like, hi, it's been a week. Are you sending them? I slipped my mind. We'll do it. And I couldn't do it. And I couldn't listen to them. And then my son was born and I had an excuse. I was like, sorry, postpartum, you know how it is. And they were like, Bess, this is like, you need to do this. So I had at this point a 5-week-old and I cleared my husband and the baby from the room. I was like, I'm going to listen to the voicemails. And I was sitting in my son's room on the nursing chair from Bye Bye Baby. And I was sitting there, the blackout curtains were drawn. So it was very dramatic. And I'm just sitting there and I'm ready. And I was like, I'm going to need a lot of time. Just be with the baby. You have his bouncy chair. This is like a ceremonial thing. I have to listen to my grandma's voicemails. And then 5 minutes later, my husband bursts in with the baby because he hears me wailing and he looks at me and I'm cracking up. I'm like, he came in, he was like, oh my God, she can't, like, this is postpartum. Like, maybe she's going to have postpartum depression now. Like, this is like, she's like,
right. It's so traumatic.
Right. Traumatic. I'm like, there are tears coming down my face. They are so much funnier than anything I could have. I will tell you a voicemail that she said. It was one sentence long and it was this: Bessie, hi, grandma. I hear you have laryngitis. Call me back. Like, you can't write that.
Yeah.
And it was just like, there was one about like, your mother says that you have a backyard and I think that's wonderful. And there's a table out there and that's great. And I love eating outside. That's wonderful. But she says that you don't have an umbrella for it. And I've seen your skin. She's like, and if you're going to sit out there in California with all your friends, you're going to be beat red. And so it was just like, these voicemails, just one after the other. Another was, I could go on and on, but they're so funny. They're all in my phone, and I think I'll play them when I need it. The next time I really need a good laugh.
That is wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this. And I was thinking about that whole piece about sort of the things we have to remind ourselves to do or not to do, and what is better than having a grandmother who is there to remind you and to be that voice to tell you to sometimes, just do what a man would do or not.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I feel like actually part of what we try to do as the Jewish Women's Archive is serve as that kind of reinforcement, right? Like, it's not your grandmother's voice, but it's everybody's grandmother's voice that is there for you as like a source of strength and reminder and humor and resilience. And we all need that so much. But thank you for bringing your grandmother's voice into that conversation, because it is beautiful and hilarious and inspiring.
Thank you for having me, Judith. And thank you to the JWA, because this is all meaningless unless I can share it. And so knowing that, and for having such smart, in-depth questions, and for really engaging with it, and for everybody for submitting great questions, this makes me feel like she's here with us now. And that's why I wrote this. It's so validating as an author, but as a granddaughter and a person. So this is very special to me. I really appreciate it.
Well, she lives on, and thank you again for joining us. Thanks to all of you for joining us and for participating in the conversation. We are taking a little hiatus from the quarantine book talks for a few weeks so that we can offer our next history course, which is actually on Jewish women's activism in the US, which starts next Thursday night, October 1st. And you can register at jwa.org/events. And we just put the link in the chat also. In the meantime, I encourage you to check out the many, many resources that we have in our digital archive at jwa.org. And new this week in particular is a collection of reflections on Justice Ginsburg's life and legacy, as well as a new podcast episode of RBG in her own words from a talk that she gave for us in 2004. And in the spirit of Bess's book, since she's capturing the stories of family, I want to say also that you might like JWA's mobile app, Story Aperture, where you can record and upload a story to JWA. And right now we are collecting many different kinds of stories, but particularly interested in voting stories right now as we approach the election. So please share with us, and even more importantly, please vote. Until next time, wishing you all a sweet and healthy new year. May you be signed and sealed in the book of life. And be healthy and take care, everybody. Until next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.